In this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple things we can think about to prevent conflict. So we can take a little hint from our buddy Smokey the Bear here that only we can prevent bad team conflict. So let's think a little bit about what do we do before we even have conflict, because in a couple other lectures we'll talk about what do we do if we have conflict to try to resolve that conflict. So one part of this idea is what can we do out ahead of the team formation? What can we do while the team's working to prevent conflict, and particularly prevent the negative types of conflict, such as process conflict or relationship conflict. So one approach to think about is Wagman and Donnefeld's conflict intervention model. And this model was established to think about what can be done at both forming and performing stages in a team to try to prevent conflict or make sure that the negative aspects of conflict don't take over and reduce team performance or effectiveness. And they basically stated 4 principles. And the first principle is that we have to start at design, right? So this again links back to how setting the team up and launching it is vital to set the team off on a path of positive process and synergy and avoid process loss. So the very first point to actually try to avoid and prevent negative conflict outcomes in teams is at the point of design. Now, this also says redesign, so there may be a reset that's required. We'll talk a little bit about process cycles, and teams should be thinking about action cycles and then kind of pause reflection cycles. And at that point, if there's a natural point for the team to do an after action review or check in on how it believes it's performing, that's another good place to think about intervening. The second principle is after the team is designed, it is the role of the leader to engage in process coaching. So again, this is a little delicate because we did already learn with goal setting that we want to think about ends, goals, or outcomes and allow teams to address the means or how. But we also know that process conflict is really negative for teams. So coaching is different than telling the team exactly how it's going to complete the project. But a good team leader should be engaged and checking in and offering support and suggestions for coaching to make sure the team has been managing processes and thinking about project management, timeline management, sub goals, process goals, to make sure that the team doesn't derail and have conflict because they haven't addressed these process issues. Then the third principle in their model is that leaders and teams should be focused on setting up norms, both with respect to how they manage team conflict, but I would also argue norms that help set the team up for effective communication and interaction that avoids the negative kinds of conflict. And I'll come back to the idea of norms in just a second. And then the final one is that ultimately people tend to start with worries about individuals or start with identifying problem people or problem personalities in the team before they look at the fact that if that team was not formed and structured well, that could cause a lot more problems for the team than an individual. And an individual struggling or maybe expressing conflict may be the outcome of a poorly designed team. So the team design should be revisited, and the team processes and norms should be addressed and coached before there's an assumption that the cause of the team's problem is a specific individual. Now, of course, there could come a point where you realize there is a very counterproductive person, and then a team membership change may be in order. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about norms because they were principle number 3 to think about establishing effective norms. And we'll step back just a little bit here because norms are or can be considered a type of informal structure. So they actually kind of are part of that team design phase. But once teams are actually functioning, both leaders and members can be thinking about, what are the norms and behavioral expectations of the team. And norms are shared expectations that guide behavior of groups. So It's hard to find a good picture to illustrate a norm, but this one, a norm might be that we actually communicate in cat language and not in dog language. And so in this team, two people are complying with the norm, two creatures are complying with the norm, and one is not. And what often happens in teams is if somebody is not behaving in a normative, expected way, the team tends to sanction those people. And that also could be a source of conflict, for example. So establishing good norms is important. But one of the things we know from research is that team members and team leaders often do not actually discuss the norms and behavioral expectations in the team. They just kind of naturally evolve as the team works together. And it is difficult for people to respond or address this if it's never formally communicated in the team. So if norms are left to naturally develop, the team members sometimes who are the most disruptive, the most vocal, sometimes the least conscientious, may be people who actually really drive the behavioral norms of the team. And we don't want that to happen. So that's why it is principle number 3 in Wagaman and Donnefeld's model, is we should be thinking ahead to what kind of norms we want to establish. So, norms can include things like expectation for participation in meetings. They can include things like communication participation, right? That people are actually there, actively there. They can be things like, should you be doing something else while you're in a team meeting? Is it acceptable to the team that someone's taking another call or texting on their phone? Those can all be normative expectations in a team. And so what we want to know is we want to actually set these up in a productive way, and we want to try to influence them so that the team gets launched in a positive behavioral trajectory to support the team performance, and not just let these happen by chance. A compelling reason to think about trying to establish positive norms in the team from the get-go is that research shows that even things that happen the first time a team meets can be evident weeks or months or even a year later. So that is the idea that these norms, once they're set up, once people start kind of acting the way they expect to act, they're not very easy to change. And part of that's because if they were never formally articulated, it's hard to attack them formally as team members or a team leader to coach about them. And it's actually quite evident and strong. And if you have any kind of unclarity about what the norms are of your team, they show up strongest when there's a membership change. So if a new member comes on board, if they do things that are different and unexpected in the team, oftentimes people react very poorly to that. And they're challenged and pressured to comply with the way the team operates. So you can see and understand what some of these behavioral norms and expectations look like, maybe at their peak when somebody new comes into the team. One way to illustrate this idea of a norm, I want to spend a little time talking just a bit more about a research article I published just a little over a year and a half ago in the Academy of Management Journal. I shared a little of that in the foundational video, but I think it would be interesting in this context to get into a little more detail about it. And I and my co-author Ling Tao, you and I published a kind of companion piece in the Harvard Business Review online earlier last year. So if you're interested in thinking about this idea of team mindfulness, you could take a look at that Harvard Business Review article. This is a little picture screenshot of the article on their website. But what I want to point out here in the context of norms is we studied and introduced this idea of team mindfulness, and we found that it had a really important role to play in effective conflict management in teams. And I think it fits because we could think about team mindfulness as a set of expectations in the team and behaviors that people carry out in the team. And we as leaders and founders of teams can set teams up to be more mindful and therefore be more effective at conflict resolution. So the picture in the foundational lecture basically, kind of laid out what we've already talked about, which is that there is this connection between task conflict and relationship conflict. And what we found in this study was that teams that displayed higher levels of team mindfulness, and I'll share what that is in just a little bit, that broke this connection. So it reduced this link. Normally what we see is that it's very common for task conflict to spill over into relationship conflict. And our study showed that teams that were more mindful had less of this connection. So the good news there is that those teams could actually stick it out and stay inside of this task conflict box and benefit from the task conflict. Our research also showed that teams that were high in team mindfulness just had less relationship conflict in general. Regardless of whether task conflict was occurring, they just had less of this kind of emotionality and relational sensitivity than teams that had less mindfulness. And then one final thing that we found was that relationship conflict we expected, these are team level qualities here, so they're kind of average levels of what's going on in the team up here. But we found that in teams that had a lot of relationship conflict, there was something called social undermining. This is another thing that people who study kind of negative organizational behaviors study this. And what social undermining means is that this is the situation where individuals are cutting each other down. So in a team, they might be overtly challenging an individual, trying to disparage their reputation. And they might be doing this privately offline. So they might be, after a team meeting, they might be scurrying down the hall and grabbing a team member or two and cutting down those people's ideas and trying to undermine what they were trying to accomplish in the meeting. And what we found is that in teams that had higher relationship conflict, there was more of this kind of individual undermining behavior happening. So all sorts of negative things going on when we have relationship conflict. So we just don't want it. If we can avoid relationship conflict, we want to get rid of it. So one thing, right, we know is more mindful teams have less of this. And so probably we expect there should be less social undermining, which we did find. And we found this connection here where it lowered this link. So it not only reduced how much relationship conflict went on in general, if it did happen to occur, it was less likely to spill over into this very personalized undermining activity in the team. So the kind of takeaway from that is that how do we get teams to be more mindful? Well, our definition and measurement of team mindfulness was derived from individual mindfulness, and that has two dimensions. It has a dimension of being a very present moment attention focused, and then also to try to reduce kind of quick rash judgments and negative judgments of one another. And so what we would argue in our study, we actually measure how much mindfulness was displayed in teams. But we would argue that leaders can play a really important role in launching teams and setting standards and expectations of mindfulness. And so that might be things like really expecting that people are looking at each other, listening well, listening before speaking, taking time to really hear what somebody has to say. People aren't on their phones, people aren't checking their email, people are truly present in the interaction that's happening. Even more so if they're working virtually like we are now. It's even more vital to focus on that present moment attention. The second part of it is the non-judgmental processing. And this does not mean we're not critical, we aren't challenging, because we know from decision making, we need to challenge each other. We need to check the assumptions. But what non-judgmental means within mindfulness is that people aren't quick to judge, and they're not quick to jump on somebody and quick to shut down an idea. They're asking some more questions. They're thinking through. They're trying to process carefully. And so if we set up an expectation that debate is good, and we want to hear from each other, and we want people to raise concerns, but we want to do that in a non-judgmental kind of information seeking approach versus a sort of challenging, critical, negative approach, that's a more mindful team. So leaders can set the tone for this, and they can also comment if they see behaviors that are representative of lower mindfulness. And if we do this, we know that this is one way to set a team up to not have as much relationship conflict from the beginning. And when teams engage in healthy task conflict, they can keep it in task conflict and not let it spill over into the negative team relationship conflict and the even more challenging interpersonal social undermining.